advocating more regulation, more socialist regulation, going back to the post-war era.
Yeah.
It didn't work then. Why do you think it'll work now?
We're in different circumstances now. We're in the worst recession that we've had since the 1930s. And why is that recession being caused? Speculation, the build-up of debt, and then that debt bubble bursting. And then we've been pushed from a recession into a depression by the same policies of the 1930s, which is cuts in wages and cuts in public expenditure. That's pushing us over the edge into a depression. The government has used every Keynesian measure now, both in terms of reducing interest rates, increasing quantitative easing, and none of it's worked. Banks themselves now are simply storing up the cash, as are a number of firms, and there's a lack of investment, therefore no growth. So we have to take control of our economy now, and that means if the banks aren't lending, we should take them into public ownership and control and make sure that we redistribute that money productively. So it is about making sure we build the homes, we build the schools, we put people back to work, we pay them a decent wage. In that way, we can come out of recession. Otherwise, this recession will be Japanese style, another decade of scraping along at the lowest barrel of economic activity.
But didn't that again happen in 1989 and 1991, that when we had the last recession, it took a number of years. The property market didn't pick up until 1995. It bounced along the bottom for a few years. Now, at the moment, we've had a recession for the last 4 years. It's been bouncing along the bottom. America's showing signs of starting to pick up, and Japan showed signs of starting to pick up. And that it may be that a little bit more quantitative easing will push the stock market up, and therefore there'll be more lending. Because after all, one of the things that the government's been trying to do is to get people to build with the new lifting of restrictions on planning thing, is to get people to put money into their homes so they can borrow against them and spend the money from the borrowing in the shops.
All the incentives that the government has put up so far, none of which have worked, and I doubt if this one will on any scale either. The deficit is increasing, borrowing increased again last month. We're getting into or even a bigger crisis than we were at the beginning. So we are faced with a Japanese-style lost decade unless action is taken. I don't think any action that's been taken so far has been decisive enough. We only nationalised those banks when they were in crisis, and we poured money into them. None of that is filtered out into the economy to increase aggregate demand. The only option that we've got now is to take direct control of this economy. As others have said, like Martin Wolf, we've been trying to control this economy by pushing string. What we need to do is have a hands-on approach, and that does mean increasing taxation, redistributing that wealth, put it into productive resources. However, we cannot stand back and allow the banks not to play a role in this, and they're refusing to at the moment. So therefore, public ownership and control is one way in which we can direct those resources to tackle this recession.
But don't you think that one of the causes of the recession was the government, the banks were accused of throwing money around and lending irresponsibly, and now they're being very prudent and they're not lending unless they see a proper investment opportunity?
Well, they're not lending at all. They're sitting on the cash and simply rebuilding their balances. And they're getting away with a crisis that they've caused themselves. They're walking away laughing all the way to the bank, literally. So what we need to do now is recognise that this economy won't get moving again unless government intervenes more directly. And the best way of doing that is controlling the banks and making sure we are investing. And the best way of controlling the banks is public ownership and control. In that way, we can then determine how many houses are built, not just through incentives to the private sector, which will most probably not work, but actually building public housing. We'll be able to rebuild our health service. We'll be able to put money into education. We'll put people back to work. We'll introduce a living wage. We'll ensure people have the money in their pockets to spend to get us out of this recession.
Did you agree with the other speaker who said that there's 13 trillion hidden in offshore bank accounts and this money should be used to be brought back to England? But how are you actually going to get the money from offshore bank accounts other than by torturing suspected wealthy people like they did in Blackadder?
Well, let's take just the UK problem. We now know, even on this government's own estimates, that there's at least 40 billion lost through tax evasion and tax avoidance. The Tax Justice Campaign, which are now widely respected, estimates that's something like 150 billion a year. Even if we just brought back half of that, 75 billion, we'd tackle our existing deficit. would be able to invest in our economy. So yes, there is a need now to ensure that we tackle tax evasion and tax avoidance. I think everybody looks at that. There's a debate going on in Parliament now about introducing new rules around tax avoidance and tax evasion. Even this government is beginning to move on this issue, but not particularly effectively. So I think the Speaker, when he was outlining the trillions that are lost to the public good as a result of avoidance and evasion, hit on a really strong vein of thought that needs to take place, and actually is very popular as well. UK Uncut was effective in raising the issue around the tax evasion that's been going on.
But all the capital taxes only produce about 4% in total of UK taxation.
Yeah.
Now,
it's because we've never taxed wealth properly.
But inheritance tax is at 40%. So even if you doubled inheritance
tax,
if
you looked at it, instead of just taxing income, you tax wealth properly, and you did a proper assessment of wealth. Professor Greg Filer has done a good exercise, which again has accepted that there are some issues around how you calculate the wealth, but nevertheless has widespread support. And he's looking at something like the 400 billion that's held in private wealth at the moment in this country, 10% tax on that, 40 billion, that's half our deficit sorted out. Could be a one-off tax or it could be an ongoing tax. Even Nick Clegg now, even the timid Nick Clegg is now talking about a wealth tax. And even the Liberals put forward the mansion tax.
They're only temporary coalition partners of the government, I believe.
They are, but the wider debate that's taking place is bringing them on side about redistribution, not just of income, but of wealth.
But the whole thing was that when there was investment income surcharge of 98%, the Inland Revenue was spending more time trying to chase comparatively small amounts of money instead of taxing.
That's why I agree. That's why identifying forms of wealth, which are very difficult to hide and very difficult to shift abroad. In addition to that, issues like the financial transaction tax, which has been debated in Parliament now, like stamp duty, which is a financial transaction tax, which operates very effectively, that introduced at a relatively small level would bring us in the income that could help us regenerate and get back into growth again and tackle this recession. So there's a whole vast range of resources out there that need to be redistributed and put into productive use. That debate is now happening.
Do you see windows being bricked up again?
No. I think there will be all sorts of measures that the accountants will seek to use to avoid fair taxation. We just have to be faster and sharper, and that's capable of doing it. On the financial transaction tax, seen as 5 years ago as anathema to any government. Even Sarkozy started the debate, and even Merkel is now looking at introducing it. Their problem is they were looking to introduce it to fund the EU. I want it to fund investment and growth.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks.